and just say hello to everybody. This is fantastic that all of these groups and public-private sectors are joined together on this call and in the spirit and intent of the ASCE NOAA MOU, the task force, and working with a lot of you already on the National Initiative Advanced Code. So I feel like we could have a whole workshop on this subject. But we can't. But as Dan said, as you see things and it piques your interest or you have a question, make sure we capture it and you know what we don't cover in the live Q&A, we'll do a follow-up. You know, that's our goal to maintain communication and collaboration across the different sectors. So NIABC is entering its second year, which would be June 1st of this year. And some of you have seen some of this content before, so I'll go through it. I want to pause at different places where we're making progress or making priorities or share things that we're doing. But we're heading towards our second anniversary, and that's right before May, and May is my favorite month out of the year. Can someone tell me why May is my favorite month?
Building Safety Month.
Oh, excellent. National
Yeah.
Building Safety Month. And fingers crossed that there'll be a presidential proclamation declaring May as National Building Safety Month. But as we, next slide. So as we take a look at the origins and the makeup, you know, there's a lot of recognition. There's a lot to reflect back on, and the recognition that we have received so far. And some notable mentions there are the work of the NIABC is now mentioned in different guidance and national documents, like the National Climate Resilience Framework and the Climate Smart Infrastructure and Implementation Guidance for Disaster Resiliency Planning Act Office of OMB. That's a mouthful. You know, the effort coming from the White House is directed towards the MITFLAG, the Mitigation Framework Leadership Group, which has organized itself as a Building Codes Task Force. And as we came together in that task force, maybe there was a dozen or less than a dozen of agencies that had a role in this space. We had to start somewhere with kind of a baseline analysis, a landscape analysis, you know, look at what we're being asked to do in terms of the focus and the priorities and actions of the NIABC, and then develop some plans for going forward. But recognizing that all of this is in the backdrop of the historical investments being made by this administration. And these are some old numbers, but this was at the beginning when we started, you know, where these new laws and grant programs are funding billions and billions of energy and building code resilience. Next slide. And so here's how we have grown. Really excited that, you know, we've grown from maybe 10 or 12 to 19 agencies represented now in the NIABC. And it's gratifying to see this level of engagement and involvement. There's lots of, you know, federal interagency groups and groups that demand the time and attention, but we've had steady involvement, engagement, as well as support engagement by our White House liaisons. Next slide. So just reorienting folks, when we look at the NIABC fact sheet, it focuses on these key priorities, and there's a lot built into each one of them, right? So you can see things, and I'm sure there's things here that resonate with your group or your community. or your interests. So modernizing building codes, improving climate resilience, reducing energy costs, focusing on underserved communities, and let's create good paying jobs along the way. Next slide. So what do we do with all these priorities? We have to organize what these actions and activities are and really point to something meaningful. And so we get that direction from the fact sheet. And number one is what federal programs are we talking about? Programs that fund construction or finance construction. Let's catalog those and let's look at to the extent that they align with modern climate and resilient building codes and standards to the greatest extent possible. The second one is recognizing that we can do that and we can have that alignment, but it's really not going to take hold and really experience to the full vision if the nation is not also embracing this. So how are we doing that? Through different grants, through incentives for support to communities, and there's growing number of ways that that's happening across the federal agencies. And then the third one is to strive for even greater resilience, not diminishing what today's modern codes and standards have become more resilient, more energy efficient, but even striving above that with stretch and above code resilience and energy efficiency standards, and where that affects the federal building portfolio. Next slide. This is a snapshot from last year, last April. And so this is going to be updated, but just wanted to give you a quick picture. Okay, what does this look like in terms of over 100 programs? What does this look like about the annual amount of funding that goes into this space, whether it's funding or financing? And then, then our metric here, how are we doing at the outset? At the outset, it reveals that there's some alignment, but there is more that needs to be done, or more that needs to be explicit. A lot of programs simply refer to local codes, but as you can imagine or appreciate, really important to define what those codes and standards need to be. So this snapshot will coming attractions, this spring, and in alignment with the second year anniversary, you'll see an updated infographic on this piece. Next slide. And also, again, this was a year ago, and so when we just look at how, forget about federal programs, how does the nation look in terms of its adoption of hazard-resistant codes? We started off this exercise at 27%. I believe we're at 32%. Still a lot of room to grow there. And then, as you recall in the priorities, we especially attuned to how this is represented in our communities, disadvantaged communities, underserved communities, those with the highest risk and low capability, low capacity. How are we finding ways to incentivize and bring codes and standards and the benefits of those to those communities? The community disaster resilient zones was a big effort that is starting work in that approach. Okay, this gave you a glimpse of what we were going to focus on last year, and we've made progress in that. So I'll be happy to show you that. Next slide. All right, and as I mentioned, recognition in documents like this, the National Climate Resilience Framework and Objective 2 on the built environment has close alignment with the work that we're doing in the NIABC, actually also with the work that's happening with ASCE and NOAA, and the emphasis on bringing climate resilience, climate data, climate research into our nation's consensus standards to increase their climate resilience. But one of the things that I note here with the framework is that it says building codes are essential integral part of this, the first ever National Climate Resilience Framework. And quoting from the framework, under the president's direction, every federal department and agency is focused on strengthening the nation's climate resilience, including by tightening flood risk standards, strengthening building codes, scaling technology solutions, protecting and restoring our lands and waters, and integrating nature-based solutions. So I heard a lot of, folks from different parts of the federal government and the private sector, and their work touches on many of those things I just read. Next slide. Here's a more very specific way that we're seeing the efforts of many of the agencies in the NIABC advancing climate and specifically flood resilience, and that's with the new minimum consensus standards from ASCE 722, supplement number 2. Really, why that's significant is that that committee decided 7 years ago now that we can no longer rely on the 100-year hazard basis. They really basically said we have to do something different. It's not working. We're going to rewrite the chapter, right? So something bold like that, and they stuck with it, and they didn't meet the deadline for the regular 2022 publication, but it came soon after in a supplement. But what's important to recognize is that the new flood requirements for design loads, number one, they've been brought into consistency from a reliability standpoint with the other hazards that are in the standard, wind and seismic, which already have and had higher return periods. They also decided that these flood provisions have to apply in an expanded floodplain, the 500-year floodplain. They also decided that for coastal areas, there needs to be an additional consideration or component related to sea level rise, relative sea level rise, to be used with a project life cycle, has to be added to the design for floodwater. And just seeing here that these agencies, 5 agencies, contributed in some form or another to what's in ASCE standard, whether it's wind or flood or seismic. And so this is showing this federal participation in these consensus standards, something that's part of the National Technology Transfer Act and OMB Circular A119. It's yielding the results and the intent that we participate in the development of these consensus standards. We bring our knowledge, expertise, our studies. We participate in the fair, open, balanced consensus process, and then we utilize these standards in different ways to meet our agency's missions. So there again, just to reiterate, it's no longer a 100-year hazard basis for flood design. Everything starts at 500-year for risk category 2, 750 for risk category 3, 1,000 for risk category 4, and that we know that FEMA, NOAA, Army Corps of Engineers, many agencies are embracing future conditions in their various efforts. And one of the ways FEMA is doing that is through its risk map program, which is evolving into the Future of Flood Risk Data Initiative. This really moves away from the binary depiction of flood risk and brings it into a new comprehensive platform with flood data, flood information, flood risk assessment. Next slide. And this, many of you know the trajectory, the process, albeit sometimes it takes a long time. You know, we see we have to wait till 2030, but this is the nature of the work of the consensus codes and standards. But progress is made and progress is recognized, and we have this to look at, to support, and to build off of, and then to recognize in a formal way now ASCE 728, that's under development now, is going to have its first ever new chapter on future conditions. That's going to be written in mandatory language. At this time, it will be available for voluntary adoption, but it's going to address situations beyond the historical depiction of these hazards related to flood, snow, rain, ice, and wind. Has a starting point of a 3 °C world, going to use climate models and modify those environmental loads, and have close linkage to the design lifespan and risk category of buildings. And many folks here are, I heard a colleague of mine is on the future conditions subcommittee, like I am. Next slide. So as I quickly went through, our starting point, how we're organized, how we're growing, we've produced a progress report at the end of 2022. Clee can provide a link to that. We're excited that the progress report for 2023 is in hand. We're adjudicating comments from the White House, and then we're going through the clearance process with the federal agencies, but have that to look forward to, for this first half of the year. And I just want to mention, let's go to the next slide. I'm sorry, go back one. Yeah. This very, yeah, okay, no, this is good. As we took a look back at the last year and a half and where our focus and efforts are, we want to redouble our efforts. What you see here on these what we call the year 2 themes. There's a bucket related to partnership and collaboration. We're excited that we're collaborating with you all here. There's a bucket on community support and incentivization and communication outreach. And then these are typified in what we call work streams. So there are a lot of experts across the federal government that on consensus codes and standards and engineering behind them, but we don't have a list, right? So the idea of a federal SME cadre has become a priority, and we're working to create that cadre this year. In terms of community support and incentivization, it's not just about how can we have grants to incentivize these activities, but it's also understanding the challenges as well as the opportunities, but the overall cost of resilience. So how do you sell this? How do you market this? And this ties in both with the communications and outreach. So a business case to advance building codes and standards for various stakeholders at the SLTT level and other decision makers, right? What is that business case when the detractors or the dissenters, moan and groan about these building codes and the changes and the resilience upgrades, and always lamenting about, oh, this is going to cost more, it's going to drive out affordability. We need to address that head on and respectfully, objectively, and thoroughly, right? With data, with facts, and with clear communication. So that's a work stream that is starting now to build that business case, if you will, so that we're equipping ourselves and our partners with the clear justification for the work that we do. Next slide. Okay, as mentioned, there's the link to the progress report, and then coming attractions is the 2023 report, and just super quick, so what we have in the coming attractions for 2023, each agency is represented in this project report. What's the status of their implementation? What's their focus and priority? What's coming ahead? And just like in the last year, just really quickly, FEMA has stood up the Brick Building Codes Plus Up program, which had an amazing response rate in the last grant period. The CEDAR's effort to align investments to those areas. Our hazard mitigation planning guidance has a stronger emphasis on codes and standards. We're seeing more and more building code and standards language in notice of funding opportunities. We have complementary efforts, as I mentioned, with the future flood risk data. We're entering into the energy code space now, thanks to the IRA provisions and FEMA's policies released for public assistance and hazard mitigation assistance to incentivize net zero energy projects and projects that use low carbon materials. Not to leave any of the hazards out, we are working with our partners at USFA with the Wildland Urban Interface web mapping tool, as well as kind of the first ever building codes losses avoided study specifically focused on fire codes. And that builds on FEMA's previous work on building code saves. One other thing I'll mention, FEMA's efforts to work in the consensus standards specifications, the ASTM, for the first ever standard specification for flood resistant materials. We talk about flood resistant materials, we have guidance on it, but there's never been a consensus standard specification, and now today there is. Our partners at HUD, very busy rolling out and implementing FFRMS and energy codes, their green retrofit and resilience program. Along the way, they've been receiving comments, public comments, that sort of, have HUD wanting to focus on well, there seems to be some resistance, there seems to be some barriers to adoption. So let's embrace that. Let's look at that very closely, and let's make that part of that business case development that I mentioned. Our partners at GSA are updating their P100 standard for federal facilities that goes beyond these hazard and resistant and minimum energy codes to higher sustainability standards. Our partners at NIST accomplished a great deal with the tornado provisions that are in the ASCE standards now, complete with design guidance and collaboration with FEMA. And this is something I learned that's impressive, that NIST contributed several chapters in the 5th National Climate Assessment evaluating climate change impacts in the US. NOAA, of course, our partners here in the progress report highlights their efforts to advance codes, incorporate codes in coastal zone management program, and including standards for language, building codes and standards language for their acquisition and construction guidelines. Also through the Sea Grant program and engagement and technical assistance to include advancing codes, and the role that they're playing with the FFRMS, with the decision support tool, and the amazing conference that was held recently, the ASCE Inspire conference. There's many more. I don't have time to go through them, but when you see the progress report, you'll see the contributions that all of the federal agencies are making, what they've made, and what their focus is on going forward. Next slide.
So, hey, John.
Okay, how am I doing?
Yeah, how are you doing?
I think we're done.
Oh, okay. My bad.
So I don't know what the elapsed time was.
Oh, no, you're perfect. If this is your last slide, which I see it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. That sounds good. Well, thank you so much, John. We want to have some Q&A here. We've got plenty of time. Those of you that are regular attendees know that Megan schedules a break for 10 minutes for every one of these meetings. I don't think we've ever used it. So, we'll see how the conversation goes. But that's kind of our little relief valve. Before we get into the conversation, I prompted a few of the ASCE members. We we had a little discussion about this. What I'd really like to do is kind of give the 3 institute presidents, and then Caroline with the government relations office, and Jennifer as well, you know, kind of like a first opportunity to offer reactions or ask questions. And then we'll go from there. So with that, Don, you're pretty close to this. Do you have any questions or comments?
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, John, for your presentations. As I've seen it and been involved with it quite a little bit, so no real questions or comments. Just the fact that it's difficult, you know, as we look at it and we look at how many jurisdictions across the U.S. have adopted the latest building codes, but we continue to, you know, to fight that because that number is very low. Less than 40% of the jurisdictions across the U.S. have adopted the latest building codes, and then how long it takes to get into the building codes into those local jurisdictions. That 10-year cycle is pretty well known, and we just need to do what we can to support the adoption of the latest building codes to help with our overall community resilience across the U.S. So that's my only comments.
And Don, I'll just chime in there. And you've heard me say that, you know, while all of that work is going on, there's a need, and there's a role for each and every one of us, from the scientist down to the consumer. And you know, I like to say this to kind of get people's attention. But when it comes to building codes, I say building codes, this time it's personal, okay? And we're really not going to see the growth and expansion if every one of us in our own way, starting with where we live or where we work, we know what those codes are. And if they're not up to snuff, we find out what the public process is, and we engage in that public process. So that's a message I've been giving various industry groups, and even amongst the ASCE members that come out to different events. Amazing work what these codes and the standards are doing and advancing, and the work that they're doing for clients on a building by building basis, but on a community basis. We need to do more. We need to do more and recognize that. And I think our business case helps. I think some of the ASCE key contacts and the recent advocacy in Hill Day, you know, gets that awareness and exposure. So we just need to keep that up and hopefully realize the benefits. Thanks.
Yeah, John, this is Norma Jean, president of COPRI, but I think that we discussed on on the call that Dan had mentioned a little bit about a tactic that ASCE and its institutes can use at the grassroots level. Mm-hmm. So many of our sections and branches, which we have sections and branches in all 50 states and in most of the territories and the district. And many of them have a legislative committee. But we also have those folks that are SEI. SEI has these local sections. And so that's a way that we can perhaps, as an organization, allow our members to see they understand the values of codes and standards. And they also have a component that reaches out to legislators and decision makers. So how can we actually get that message to those folks at the grassroots level to say that they are part of this process and how they can help in moving the needle forward so we can have more resilient communities, which is important to ASCE members.
All right,
absolutely.
Thanks, Norma Jean. Shirley, you want to weigh in from the EWRI perspective?
Sure, I'll come in from two pieces, and my apologies, I'm driving. Two things. One, I'm going to agree with what Norma Jean said, and anything we can do to get talking points to take to these or to give to our sections and branches, the better off we are. It's particularly thinking about what John said about, the development of reports around costs saved versus cost expended is going to be absolutely critical. And the second one, I'm going to come back into, again, EWI deal as much with building codes per se in terms of, resilience to storms and things like that. But with the urban underground infrastructure around water, they are certainly highly susceptible to the same types of events that are going to affect our buildings. And so it's going to be critically important with that. What I was really thinking about, it's been a conversation in the task force, has been around issues of underground urban infrastructure and unmapped underground infrastructure, and the fact that we don't have urban floodplains and things like that, but we still need to be applying that kind of a risk thought process and the risk scenario analysis to a lot of our underground urban infrastructure, because again, we know it's flooding in these intense storms. And we also know that when those things flood and the streets fill up, they end up in the basements and all that. And we are ending up with again, back to the problem we're trying to solve, but in places where people don't know that they're at risk. So that would be my addition to that as I'm driving down the road past the Amish buggies.
All right, thanks, Shirley.
Hey,
All
can
right.
I just
go
add
ahead. I
something?
was going to go to you next, Caroline. So go ahead.
Thanks, Dan, with all the discussion on advocacy. I thought I would hop in. The one thing I would state, Shirley had mentioned, for example, developing things like talking points related to building codes. It's absolutely something that our office is capable of doing, but what we don't have is really that access to all of the building code officials across the country. So we can absolutely, arm our sections and branches and our members with a lot of the content and the talking points. But we don't really have is the ability to start to identify some of those opportunities where we can be engaging. And that's really where we need our members to kind of give to present us, when there's going to be a hearing at the local level or at the state level, when they're going to be updating their codes and really coming to us about what they need. And then we can absolutely provide them those talking points. So being able to make sure we're collaborating, working with the institutes, working with FEMA to kind of identify those opportunities, and then, act where we can.
All right, excellent.
And Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's
Sure.
exactly what I was thinking, is being also the vice president of our local chapter, that it's a way to get presentations or information out in front of our members who often are active in their local communities and different boards and all of that, that they can then provide that feedback into the local communities about the necessities.
All right, thanks, Shirley. Okay, other questions or comments? Just raise your hand. Okay, I've got a couple, but anybody feel free to interrupt if you want, or raise your hand. I'll come back to you. The first one is, I think this is a great initiative, and obviously ASCE and the NIABC have kind of a shared interest in seeing hazard-based building codes more widely adopted and enforced. And so, I think ASCE can, as the Institute presidents and Caroline mentioned, we can be a voice, we can be, somebody else that's been a bit of a cheerleader or advocate. And I know at most of the meetings I'm at, where the whole standards initiative and the task force comes up, there's almost always somebody will make the pitch that engineers need to go down and get involved at the local level. But it's, I guess the question is there something beyond that John, you or MITFLAG or anybody on the call can envision ASCE doing? If just continuing to be a voice of reason and advocates is helpful, obviously, we can, Caroline's office, as she's mentioned, we can work with NIABC to get some talking points together. But, was there a particular, what would you like to see change as the result of your appearance here? I guess that's really the fine point.
Yeah, absolutely. And others can chime in, but I think one of the areas, Dan, is, and it's embraced in your task force, it's represented in NIABC, it's happening at the agencies, but really, what is it going to take? What is the data? What is the methodology? What are the studies that really are going to bring future conditions provisions in a meaningful way into the ASCE standards, and then, you know, by the logical progression into our nation's building code. So while it's great that you know, ASCE has done this, you know, turn the corner on flood resilience, they did so with the expectation, hey, sooner or later, maps and data and different return periods and velocities and better information of flood hazard and flood risk information is going to become available, right? And FEMA is very attuned to that and is working as hard and fast as they can. But you know, we need to recognize what are those things that you know, we're not the builders, we're not the developers, but we have to look through that mindset, and what do developers need to know about the building that they're proposing, the development that they're putting in. How should they start using future conditions? What does this information look like in viewers and in platforms? And what is it helpful for them to know about the conditions for climate and flood, not just today, but 30 to 50 years out? What are the changes in the potential flood and climate risk? Will there be increased depths, increased velocities? And then with that information, then they can make decisions. Okay, then I need to design my building or my foundation in this way to be more resilient. So when we think about all the science and data that's going in, we want to make the extension of that to the practical application, right, Don? So that engineers can do their job on behalf of builders and developers, and all that information is being able to be translated, accessible, verifiable, enforceable, and done through, in compliance with our nation's codes. So I think it's just recognizing that and understanding where we have that situation covered and where we don't. There's going to be things in the future conditions chapter that are just not ready, that, you know, that we don't have the data, we don't have the information. We'll have plenty of commentary, hey, consider this, right? But if we want to be successful, you know, now is the opportunity to really focus in and leverage all the expertise that's coming from the various federal agencies. So that's kind of how I would say. What else are the things that you know, we should focus and collaborate on, have a common understanding?
Right. So I guess kind of what I'm hearing is there's basically two avenues here. One is technical. Obviously, ASCE is working more closely with the federal agencies to bring as much technical expertise to bear in the development and update of these codes and standards as possible. And you know, there's two aspects of that. One is, you know, the good work that the federal agencies do, develops data, that data finds its way into the standards process. The second aspect of that is you have initiatives like NOAA, USGS, where they are specifically, you know, communicating with ASCE about ASCE's needs for data in the future, and are aligning their programs to provide that information so they can be specifically incorporated into a standard. You know, right now we've got 30 plus years of climate science. There's a significant amount of research done in that area every year. But translating that into information that can be readily used by an engineer is a real challenge. That's the primary workload of these committees that do these standards, and most of that work is done voluntarily. So,
yes.
you know, I just want to make that point. Okay, so that's on the technical side. Then getting these codes and standards adopted is a little bit more of a communication process point, right? And political point. And so, you know, how ASCE can promote the adoption of standards, I mean, I would be thrilled if we could get to the 90% level and it was all just based on observed conditions rather than future conditions, because that in itself would make a huge difference given the nature of where we are. So I guess that's what I'm asking. I mean, we know we're doing the good work on the technical side, but are you thinking, and I guess I'm just reading into the significant number of EOP individuals on here, is there an opportunity for ASCE and the administration, or at least MIT-FLAG, to advance the more of the argument for adopting standards to begin with? Let's assume they're solid technical standards, but how do we get those into codes? How do we get codes adopted? Is there a role for ASCE, especially our 150,000 members? All right. Well, sounds good. Any other last minute questions or thoughts, or
Dan,
ruminating? There you go. Go ahead, John.
Oh, I can't speak for our White House friends, but with the focus on underserved communities, then we know what our targets are, and then we can understand in those places what is the level of data and hazard information, and what do they have to work with, and if that's where the greatest need is, then then identifying those and trying to plug those gaps with flood and other climate hazard information, upon which these consensus standards and then model codes can be put into effect.
All right, thanks, John.
Thank you.